afternoon to the audience. Welcome to the Center for Biosecurity Studies and the launch of our Big Ocean States initiative here at the UWI campus. And today we have a very interesting lineup of varied persons to present to you some really exciting and invigorating presentations on the ocean environment and also the blue economy, and all within the context of biosecurity. Really fascinating and really exciting. So I want to start first by just delivering to you my introduction of this Big Ocean State initiative. This is our Big Ocean States initiative, and it looks at the blue economy. It looks at the opportunities, the economic opportunities that lie within the ocean, within the Caribbean. And this is just a brief review of who we are at the Center for Biosecurity Studies. We were established in 2019 here on the Cape campus. And the aim of the center is to support regional governments and societies in the Caribbean to tackle the litany of biosecurity vulnerabilities that threaten our biological ecosystems and impact on health, the environment, and also on climate. We have 6 different major pillars upon which we build our development of the center. We have 3 main focal areas: border security and trade, climate change and its impacts, and also maritime issues and the blue economy, of which this particular initiative is very pivotal. And this is also a brief review of what biosecurity is in terms of the context of it. We have been given the exposure to biosecurity as really the movement of pests and pathogens across borders. But we have expanded that definition of biosecurity here at the center to redefine it as the science and practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods. And this is done through the reduction of systematic vulnerabilities to biological ecosystems. And this is because of the context of the Caribbean being in a group of small island developing states. We are inherently exposed to a number of different vulnerabilities, from human trafficking, cybercrime, obviously the climate change impacts, hurricanes, severe weather systems, drought, you name it, it all occurs here in the Caribbean. And this is just one tool that we've designed to analyze the risks that we will encounter with these plethora of impacts that we've come across within the Caribbean. And it's supposed to drive the interdisciplinarity. They have the political, the economic, the social, technological, health, environment, the ethical aspect, and also the legal aspect of it. And these are the different, quote unquote, lenses that we see biosecurity through. And this gives an idea of marine biosecurity. It may be something that a lot of persons are not familiar with, but this is definitely a thing out there in the academia. So what is the Caribbean Big Ocean States Initiative? And this initiative seeks to minimize or support Caribbean governments rather in minimizing global warming with greenhouse gas emissions, tsunami threats, sea level rise, warming oceans, marine pollution, marine bioeconomy, marine bio-extractives, coral reef bleaching, ballast water management, and obviously the invasive marine species, inadequate maritime waste management, sargassum, which is very common within the Caribbean, and also occupational health and safety at sea, and also overall to strengthen our ocean governance legislation and policy framework. So the goals and objectives are to maximize the potential of the ocean and marine environments in the Caribbean, to protect the blue ocean economy potential, to develop education and training programs, and to also establish CBS as a regional knowledge hub for the bioeconomy, the blue economy, and sustainability here in the Caribbean. And these are just some of the initiatives the challenges that we encounter. This is the blue economy and the sustainable development and economic recovery. And this is a quote coming from the director of the Center for the Blue Economy, Jason Scores. And in particular, I like what he coined in this particular quote, that we need to rethink our relationship with 3/4 of the planet and develop new economist development strategies that will protect vulnerable communities, create jobs in the offshore clean energy, and invest in resilient coastal infrastructure. And one of the major things that you will see coming out in one of the presentations from Dr. Guppy is marine bio-extractives. And this shows some of the potential, the economic potential that lies within the blue economy, from the knowledge economy in terms of data. And we also have a presenter, Mr. Antonio Hollingsworth. He will present on that with the Bluebot, and also different waste streams from fisheries and also from the comp industry. And then we also have marine minerals and mining and the opportunity for renewable energy as well. We'll also be looking at the role the ocean plays within climate and try to develop some climate ocean models and also ocean disaster risk models as well. And dealing with maritime disaster is something that we are also faced with. And this is something that we will be exploring in greater detail. And more information on this will be forthcoming soon. And obviously, we have the impact of AI, machine learning, and the maritime environment, and how we can actually utilize this type of technology to give us some benefit and an advantage in terms of reducing the risk of these events and impacts in the future. And finally, we turn to the Caribbean Ocean Governance legislation. And this legal review will seek to examine the ocean governance legislation to establish the critical gaps and deficiencies that will be needed to address and to help strengthen awareness and enforcement of ocean governance within the Caribbean. And we have Ms. Sanya Compton, who's one of our presenters, and she will be giving us some more details on ocean governance within the Caribbean as well. And so with that, I leave you with this flyer, which is the flyer for this particular initiative. And now we will turn to the first presenter, which will be Ms. Sanya Compton. And Ms. Sanya Compton, she holds a BSc in Marine Sciences with a minor in Environmental Science and an MSc in Marine Sciences in terms of the Marine Policy track from Savannah State University, Savannah, Georgia. For both degrees, Ms. Compton graduated with honors and was awarded the most outstanding graduate student upon receiving her master's degree in 2015. Sanya is now concluding her PhD in natural resources management with a focus on governance while working as a research assistant and consultant at the University of the West Indies with the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, or CERMES. For her thesis research, Sanya is examining the conditions needed to support, in a practical manner, national level, multi-stakeholder governance arrangements, such as national intersectoral coordination mechanism, or NICs, within Caribbean countries. And this is critical given the limited capacities of smaller and developing states, in particular as they strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, or other global and regional targets, or to pursue the blue economy and growth and the economic growth. Her work-related projects include areas such as fisheries and ocean governance and management, including aspects of gender and policy influence. In her limited extracurricular time, Ms. Compton is the editor and coordinator for the UWI Cave Hill Chrysalis Research Magazine, and is also the Science and Technology faculty representative for the Cave Hill Association of Postgraduate Students, or CHAPS, And she has an avid love for nature, especially marine and terrestrial sea and landscapes, cooking gourmet meals for therapy, and activates her formal training in dancing as a choreographer and offers free dance technique courses as time permits. So I introduce to you now, Miss Sanya Compton.
Thank you so much. That was quite the introduction. I do appreciate it. And I do appreciate being part of this initiative, kickstarting this initiative, and being a part of today's rather diverse panel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this time. All right, I assume everyone can see the screen. If you can please confirm quickly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so again, I'm very appreciative to be a part of this initiative on Big Ocean States. And as indicated, my short presentation would be on marine governance, briefly exploring that in terms of what's happening in the Eastern Caribbean. So getting right into it. Countries in the Caribbean region are highly dependent on their coastal and marine resources, as well as the associated goods and services that are generated from these resources, some of which include living marine resources such as fisheries, mangroves, coral reefs. You also have our beaches and coastal lands that are used for tourism and infrastructural development. And we also have a dependency on our maritime services, such as shipping and transportation. And we definitely saw how important those have been for us, especially in light of COVID. The region's marine sector is very important to our economies, livelihoods, and food security. As small island developing states, countries in the Caribbean are especially vulnerable to social, economic, and environmental pressures. They are also characterized by limited capacities, such as institutional, scientific, and human capacities. So these high dependencies on our marine resources and the vulnerabilities as well as limited capacities inevitably leads to environmental degradation, resulting in overexploitation, I should say, of our resources, as well as habitat destruction and pollution. This presents the need for governance. An important consideration when assessing marine governance is the fact that many of these resources are shared across countries, meaning they are transboundary. Therefore, protecting the marine environment against current and potential threat is essential. The wider Caribbean region, as pictured here, is one of the most geopolitically and socio-economically complex regions. Therefore, good governance is needed and is essential to addressing environmental challenges associated with marine ecosystem goods and services. In order for governance to be good, it must first be effective, and good governance can be considered the extent to which governance arrangements or the mechanisms and processes are reflective of accepted norms, principles, and values. And good governance itself is based on a set of principles, and these include such as accountability, transparency, equity, and inclusiveness. Now, looking at governance frameworks and how that relates to the blue economy. The notion of a blue economy quickly became globally accepted after the Rio 20 Conference on Sustainable Development. This was back in 2012. However, the implementation has been limited and slow at best. And this is not especially surprising because it is quite typical to have a lag time between these development concepts, their articulation versus when they're actually being implemented. And successful implementation of the blue economy will require national and regional level ocean governance with sectoral integration across civil society, the public and private sectors. In order to realize the objectives of the blue economy and that of improved governance of our transboundary living marine resources, one must take into account the frameworks and institutions that are already in place. And again, my focus here is on the Eastern Caribbean. So there is the 2013 OECS Eastern Caribbean Regional Ocean Policy, or ECROP, which is currently being revised. And this provides goals, priorities, and strategic actions that are all aimed at accelerating the transition to a blue economy. A related OECS initiative has been the Caribbean Regional Oceanscape Project, which has been geared towards strengthening the capacity of ocean governance in the Eastern Caribbean. Through the CROP, they have been able to develop national ocean policies and coastal and marine spatial plans for 5 participating CROP countries. So alongside the CROP and the ECROP, there is also the St. George's Declaration, which is also being revised, and the anticipated 2040 vision for this declaration presents a participatory and adaptive framework with 6 priority areas, and these include ocean and fisheries, climate and disaster, biodiversity and ecosystems, land and water resources, as well as sustainable energy and pollution. Another framework is the Large Marine Ecosystem Governance Framework, which was developed for the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem Project, also known as the CLME project. And this framework addresses issues of scale, complexity, and interactions. The CLME project was also instrumental in developing a 10-year strategic action program, or SAP. And one of the main strategies of this SAP is intersectoral coordination, as you see there in bold, that's strategy 3. And intersectoral coordination speaks directly to effective governance of marine resources. Now, in addition to these frameworks, there are also regional and global instruments that support improved governance of our region's marine resources. And these include several multilateral environmental agreements, and there's also the well-known Sustainable Development Goals. And SDG 14 speaks to life below water, which addresses issues of governance. In order for these frameworks and instruments to become operationalized, governance arrangements should be in place. And these are the mechanisms that actively support governance to roll out and implement the activities, plans, and policies set forth by the existing frameworks. At the regional level, there are several intergovernmental organizations that exist and collaborate on marine governance initiatives. For the sake of time and the purpose of today's presentation, I will again focus on the OECS as well as highlight CARICOM. The OECS has an ocean governance and fisheries unit, and they were the ones responsible for the implementation of that Caribbean Regional Oceanscape Project. There's also an ocean governance team, which comprises of focal points from each of the OECS member states. CARICOM has various entities that coordinate and collaborate on ocean and marine related governance projects, programs, and initiatives. For example, there's the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, or CRFM. There's also the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, 5Cs, and of course, the University of the West Indies. CERMES in particular has been leading on research and application of marine governance throughout the region. While things at the regional level appear to be a bit more organized and processes a bit better understood, the same is not necessarily true at the national level. And it is at this national level that these developmental concepts have to be realized and take effect. National Intersectoral Coordinating Mechanisms, or NICs for short, have been identified as critical to effective governance. NICs are multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-level arrangements linked through policy cycles and are based on these principles of good governance. the CLME Plus project alongside the OECS crop have placed a focus on better understanding these arrangements for marine and ocean governance in the region. And the goal here is to develop and strengthen these arrangements. The OECS, through the national ocean policies that developed for some countries, called for the establishment of national ocean governance committees, and they are a type of NIC. The work on my thesis, as well as work that I do for CERMES, has focused on these types of governance arrangements. And here, what I have laid out is just a few of the more recent publications that have focused on NICs. Small islands are typically portrayed as vulnerable and insignificant on the international sphere. However, there is an emerging self-identification of large or big ocean states that small ocean states are now employing. The possession of sovereign authority over large bodies of water that surround us can be viewed in the context of ocean governance as it relates to the blue economy. Good ocean governance provides a balanced and coordinated way to manage competing demands for marine resources while ensuring that the health of ocean ecosystems is sustained. In realizing developmental goals, the way forward can start with an appreciation for our marine resources and the ecosystem services that they provide, as well as ensuring there's appropriate groups that are being engaged and fully involved in the governance process. There needs to be an information and knowledge exchange, and importantly, translation of the vision into action. So how does this now tie into biosecurity? Ocean governance relies on the principles of ecological sustainability. Biosecurity management allows countries to meet ecological obligations and provides protection from potential degradation and supports economic, social, and cultural values. Issues related to marine non-indigenous species as well as biopiracy can and should be addressed within the context of marine governance. So thank you so much for your time and listening to my presentation. I do look forward to the discussion that follows.
Thanks very much, Ms. Compton, for a very intriguing presentation. And I like how you dovetailed biosecurity into ocean governance and the importance of it. And we know within the Caribbean that our oceans are one of the major attractions for visitors to our islands, as we depend so heavily on tourism. So this is going to be very critical and crucial to the economic development of the rest of the Caribbean in the very near future and also as time goes by. So thanks to Ms. Compton, and now we turn to Mr. Dayne Buddo. It's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. And I will just do a brief introduction for you. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so Dr. Dayne Buddo is the Director of External Engagement at the Georgia Aquarium. And he is responsible for deepening the service ties to the community at the local, state, and national, and also international levels. These mission-based interventions support the Georgia Aquarium's conservation and education programs. Prior to joining the Georgia Aquarium, Dr. Buddo was the director of the Bay Academy, the Bay Ecotarium in San Francisco, California. Before moving to the US, he served as a tenured faculty member at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, in marine sciences for over 1 decade, with the responsibility for marine research and teaching at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab. Dr. Buddo was also CEO and research director for the Alligator Head Foundation and Marine Lab, focusing on marine protected areas. He was also the Marine Conservation Advisor for the TBA21 Academy and Art Foundation in Europe, centered on ocean conservation and climate change. Dr. Buddo has published several papers on marine invasive species, shark conservation and fisheries management in the Atlantic region, including the co-authored book on lionfish management in the Caribbean, global assessment of sharks, nature, and the IUCN Red List for Atlantic shore fishes. He was also one of the lead authors of the America's Assessment for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Dayne has been a consultant for marine projects for CARICOM, the government of Japan, the World Bank, International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, the Nature Conservancy, among others, and has conducted work in over 30 countries. He has worked closely with the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, UNCB, International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, the Global Environment Facility, GEF, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, among many other agencies. He currently sits on the Board of Advisors for the Ocean Foundation, Fisheries Development Management Fund, National Conservation Trust Fund Grant Committee, and continues to support several delegations to major United Nations conferences on climate change and ocean conservation. Dayne is also a certified PADI master instructor, advanced rebreather diver, and emergency first response, first aid, CPR, AED instructor, as well as hyperbaric or the recompression chamber safety director. So without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Dayne Buddo. You have the floor, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from California. Hope you're hearing me okay. I'm going to jump in and share the screen. Thank you so much, Kirk, for that introduction. Let me just jump in and share the screen here. Okay, let me know if you're not seeing my screen.
Yes, we are
seeing it. Perfect. Yes. So I know we only have about 10 minutes for this talk, so I'm going to give a high-level overview of ballast water management and invasive species, specifically with respect to the Caribbean, and its threats to the blue economy. So just to really put this into context, an alien species is usually one that originates from another location. In most instances, it's from another country. But in some instances, for example, a large country like the United States, you can have one species moving from one area of the country to the next, and it is regarded as alien as well. At some points, some of these species will start cause problems for the native species. And at that point, it is then described as being invasive. And when it's described as being invasive, this is when we start to pay a lot more attention to it in terms of the law, the legislation, the policy, and the management. Of course, you can have native invasive species that move from one section of a country that are already native, but become invasive and start to, to show these, these kind of invasive traits where they are displacing native species. They are described as being the greatest threat to biodiversity after habitat destruction. So invasive species will pretty much upset that balance of diversity that we want to make sure that does obtain. And this is the same with the terrestrial as well as the marine environment, as well as freshwater environment. You have species coming in and pretty much taking over these particular areas and displacing native species for food and for space. The number one way where marine invasive species get from one country to the next is via ballast water. You have other vectors and pathways such as the aquarium trade, hull fouling, intentional displacement taken from one to the next, for example, like aquaculture facilities, and then accidental release. But the number one way is ballast water. So ballast water is absolutely necessary at this point for shipping. We really can't do without it. And you're talking about 33,000 large cargo ships. And these cargo ships are taking a significant amount of ballast water. And this is used to balance that ship with reference to its cargo that's being held on board or not held on board. That stability is totally essential for the ship's operation. So here's the problem. At the source port, let's say a ship has no cargo and it needs to take on seawater, let's say from Trinidad, before its voyage up to Jamaica. It takes on that seawater to balance off that ship so it doesn't topple over on the high seas. But it's not just taking up the water, it's also taking up the organisms present in that water, in that bay. On the voyage, the cargo hold is still empty, but it's filled, the ballast tank surrounding it is totally full of water and organisms, many of which will die, but the ones that do survive this 3 or 4 or 5 day voyage are the really difficult ones, they're the hardy ones. So once it gets to the destination port, let's say Kingston Harbor in Jamaica, before it's starting to load cargo on, it has to get rid of that ballast water. And the ones that survive are the ones that can potentially invade and have invaded several areas in the destination ports. How much water are we really talking about? In large cargo vessels, you can have as much as 200,000 cubic meters of seawater being moved from one location to the next. This is the same amount of water in about 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So it's a significant amount of water we're talking about. The IMO estimates that about 10 billion tons of water are moved around the world each year. And if you have ever taken a water sample, a 1 liter water sample from the ocean and filter that down and look at the number of organisms present, you can then imagine how many organisms are moved around in 10 billion tons of water. The living conditions are very harsh in the ballast tanks. You're talking about low light, low oxygen, and most of these organisms will die. But ships are becoming faster, and which then increases the survivability of these organisms before they get to the destination port. About 10,000 species travel in that water every day, and every 9 weeks, a new invasive species establishes itself somewhere new. But with respect to human health, there have been several cases. We've had a significant case in Peru in 1991 from cholera, and it was linked directly to ballast water. 10,000 persons died in Peru, and that was, of course, an underestimate. But that has been linked directly to ballast water. Other things that are moved around in terms of disease carrying agents, Clostridium, Salmonella, E. coli, and other enteroviruses move around in this water. In addition to the bacteria and viruses, there are some species such as toxic microalgae that can cause paralysis, shellfish poisoning, have been reported and have been transferred via ballast water as well. So right now, there's no mechanism for totally emptying the ballast tanks on the high seas. So it is always that amount of water coming from one area to the next. So let's say we have a bay where there's a significant risk based on the species within that bay. Those species can remain in that ballast tank for several ports because you can't get rid of the entire amount of ballast water inside those tanks when they are trying to transfer it, exchange it out on the high seas. The greatest source of contamination is that biofilm. If you've ever put a bucket outside for any of water outside for any period of time, you start seeing a film on the inside of that bucket. And it is the same thing in the ballast tank. There's a layer of biofilm filled with organisms and microorganisms on the inside of these ballast tanks. And of course, that continues to colonize or to contaminate ballast water being moved from one place to the next. There are promotions, and a lot of ships have been using this as well, promoting the exchange at sea. So taking the bay water out on the high seas and exchanging it with oceanic water is one of the ways of treating ballast water, so to speak, So when you get to your destination port, you can then release oceanic water versus bay water, which the principle is that the bay species can't survive on open ocean, and the open ocean species can't survive in the bay. So you've created some kind of ecological barrier. But following exchange at sea, sometimes these ballast tanks actually get more oxygenated water, and that can lead to population expansion within the ballast tank itself. The number of disease-producing organisms can reach significantly higher levels before the exchange as well. And the flush seawater will contain more oxygen and less nitrogen. So some treatment methods of ballast water, of course, I mentioned a while ago, ballast water exchange, which is generally accepted as preferred. And I will talk about the standards in our couple slides now. The use of chemical biocides, heat treatment, filtration, UV radiation, among others. And there are technologies being developed and approved by the IMO progressively as well. But essentially what they're trying to do is to treat the ballast water on board while they're on the voyage before they get to that destination port. So when it's released, you're releasing ballast water that's less harmful to that country. So the IMO Ballast Water Convention entered into force in 2017, which then requires all ships, especially the ones that have a flag state that have signed on to the convention, or a port state, belong to a port state that has signed on to that convention, to follow certain requirements. Three main ones include the ballast water management plan. It has to have a plan that is implemented that manages that ballast water, whether it's treatment, whether it's how they exchange it at sea, whatever it is, it has to be managed. There has to be a ballast water record book that is kept on board to deal with circulated and treatment of ballast water for management purposes, and of course discharge into the sea. And this has to be available for inspection at all times. Each ship has to have an international ballast water management certificate, which is issued by the flag state. So two standards that I mentioned before, the D1 standard requires ships to exchange their ballast water on open seas, 200 miles from land, in water at least 200 meters deep. Of course, you think about the Caribbean, especially the Eastern Caribbean, there's not many places you can find 200 miles off from any land and 200 meters deep. So there is a contingency amount as well, which is 50 miles and 200 meters deep. The D2 standard, which is a stronger standard, specifies the maximum amount of viable organisms, living organisms allowed to be discharged, which requires a certain amount of testing, and it has to be checked as well. All ships are required to meet the D1 standard, and all new ships that are being built after the convention came into force require onboard treatment facilities to meet that D2 standard. So in summary, the Caribbean has been invaded by alien species and continues to be vulnerable. We're talking about green mussels, we're talking about lionfish and all other viruses as well that have been invaded and linked to ballast water. The marine invasive species have shown to have significant impact on biodiversity, public health, as well as the economy, and prevention is usually the best option. So in this instance, ballast water management is extremely important, and all countries need to enforce the convention and make sure that these ships are not releasing ballast water that's potentially harmful to their EEZ. With that, I will just end, and I will look forward to some questions.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dr. Buddo. Very intriguing presentation. I learned quite a bit about ballast water management and also what should or shouldn't be going on here in the Caribbean as well. And now we turn our attention to Mr. Antonio Hollingsworth, and he will be presenting on Bluebot project. And I'll just give a brief introduction of Bajan Digital Creations, or BDCI, which is an emerging technology startup. Sorry about that. Cool. Bajan Digital Creations, BDCI, is an emerging technology startup offering integrative smart tech solutions to civic and corporate challenges. BDCI helps organizations identify and implement effective result-driven solutions. BDCI was founded on the island of Barbados in 2018. It's been nominated for innovative use of technology in tourism at the World Summit Awards 2018. It was also the winner of the Blue Tank 2020 Challenge of the UNDP Accelerator Labs with the Bluebot project and Marine Solution. Mr. Hollingsworth is the developer of Hyero Help, an interactive cultural, conversational, and digital voice assistant. Google Street View approved company with over 1 million global views of our immense media content. BDCI is also developed geolocated augmented reality content. And the executive team is comprised of Mr. Antonio Stevenson, and he has a degree in chemical and process engineering. Stevenson is also an experienced educator in mathematics, physics, and chemistry. He has experience in teaching, working with, and building programs for children on the autism spectrum. As a practicing data scientist and digital developer, Stevenson excels at digital designing, personalities for artificially intelligent entities. And when not spearheading his company, BDCI, he teaches the fundamentals of coding and design in a Kids Who Code program. And also part of that executive team is a co-founder, Stacey R. Phillips, and she's qualified in mass media and communications. Stacey specializes in graphical user interface design, GUI, user experience design, UX, visual communication design, and corporate communications. She excels in design, strategy, and execution, and has a solid background in managing complex commercial and philanthropic projects. Between the demands of the startup, Stacey makes the time to assist several nonprofit and community-based organizations with branding and communications design. So now I turn over to you, Mr. Hollingsworth.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Douglas, thank you for inviting me to this opportunity. So I won't be as theoretical as the others in terms of the academics. That's not necessarily where we are. We are a private sector company, and we focus on application of smart solutions. So what exactly is the Bluebot project? What's it about? We have simplified it because we know artificial intelligence is something that lots of people are accustomed to hearing about, but don't necessarily understand where and how it works. So a bit of background in terms of what it is. It is any system that is going to mimic human interaction or human behavior or human thought. So in this specific case with Bluebot, we are looking at computer vision, and we're looking at analysis that's going to be occurring utilizing artificial intelligence. So I'm going to switch to share my screen, give a good video. Hope that you're able to hear the video. If not, I'll just explain afterwards.
The Bluebot project boosts the rate of data collection and the rate of insight discovery from marine image data. Obtaining reliable and authenticated underwater data is slow, can be dangerous, takes a toll on the human body, and can be tedious to process. So we use underwater robots and artificial intelligence to improve data collection. The Bluebot project is a marine solution that collects and processes underwater video data faster, cheaper, safer, and with greater accuracy. Currently based in Barbados, The Bluebot project was a winning proposal in the UNDP Accelerator Labs for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean's Blue Tank Competition 2020. This project, the only one of its kind in the Caribbean, was conceptualized and executed by Bajan Digital Creations Incorporated.
So we have the tagline, "Data is beautiful." In 2020, we presented the Bluebot project to the UNDP Accelerator's Blue Tank Challenge, and we were one of the winners. At the point in time, our intent was to collect video data to build out a data set to train machine learning algorithms on. This was for future, that was the intention, for future developers to train algorithms on. However, COVID came into play, and we had to meet some standards in terms of getting the project completed. And because we did not have access to ready human labor, we had to solve that problem. So we utilized robots and we utilized artificial intelligence that we customized to be able to look at our local video data that was collected and analyze that and create data sets. So the first thing that we did is that we trained an algorithm to identify fish. That was it, to be able to identify where a fish was and where a fish was not. It was very interesting in sorting that data. But in so doing, we recognized that there was an underlying anomaly in the data. So when we collected images from one location and compared it to another location, there were differences that turned up in the data, which I wouldn't have picked up as a human being going through the frames. But the machine was picking them up, in the program was picking up the patterns as it went through thousands of images. And out of that, we developed, further developed the algorithm to be able to take that data, that visual data that would have been collected from a particular location, and build out on that based on 3 key species for now. So the 3 key species that we're looking at would be sergeant majors, we're looking at parrotfish, and we're looking at surgeonfish. We also have trained the algorithm to detect lionfish. However, in our data, we have not found any lionfish near shore. I should qualify that our data is near shore, so that's within 100 meters of the shoreline, and the depth is down to around 10 meters maximum so far. The robots are capable of going much further than that. They have a depth ceiling of 100 meters. And we currently have 1 operational right now because we've been utilizing it to collect as much data as possible. Now, the way we are collecting data is because of this one mantra: you can only manage what you measure. And being able to measure what is going on underwater is not easy. You have to take into account currents, divers, boats, weather, tides, and onshore activities. And collecting that data is very hard and very expensive. By utilizing underwater robots, what we do is that we work with the whole process of data collection in that we accelerate the rate at which you can collect the data. So, for example, we can deploy a robot for a couple of hours, and that robot's going to collect the information, and then the algorithm processes the information. It would take me about half a day to go through a couple thousand images to verify that the algorithm is correct. But the algorithm is going to power through that data, thousands of images, in a couple of minutes. So what we've done is compress the time to get that data available and extract insights from that data. We've compressed the time from months or weeks down to days or minutes. And that's the concept behind Bluebot. There's some other stuff that we're working on right now. However, those things fall under IP. And that's something that we want people to now start looking to the blue economy, to not just see it as a place where you fish, but to understand that within that environment, there's a lot of information There are relationships between species, there are relationships in terms of structures, there is knowledge in terms of that can be extracted in terms of biomimicry, there's knowledge that can be extracted in terms of the biochemistry. All of these things are connected in what I like to term as nature's largest R&D department, the ocean. It has billions of years on us. But we as human beings need to now be able to extract that information and utilize it to benefit both the ocean and ourselves. And as a large marine island state, or a big ocean state, as we were discussing it, we have more future in the ocean than we do on land. We're going to run out of land space pretty soon. Any impact that we have on the land is going to be it's going to affect us. It's going to be potentially small in scale of what is going to happen in the ocean. So we may have agriculture on land, which is great, but if we have pollution in the ocean, acidification in the ocean, hypoxia in the ocean, those things are going to now affect us back on land, especially in terms of coral, the loss of biodiversity due to a coral species being taken out, or a fish being taken out, or as simple as a case of where we detected algae growth increased because there weren't enough sea urchins in a particular area, and that's over an 11-month period. So these are things that artificial intelligence allows us to extract from the ocean, that insight that helps to shape policies that can affect the future. And that's where we're looking at. We're looking at the future. What does the future hold for our blue economy when we are focusing on a particular type of tourism? What impact does that have on a particular species of fish? What impact does that fish have on another species? And how do those species interact on the reef in order to keep the thing that is bringing the tourists to us in health, or in a manner that is useful? No visitor wants to come to a reef and find no fish. They want to see fish. They want to be able to interact and swim with the fish. But if we are polluting near shore reefs, or if we are engaging in feeding one species where they outcompete another that is critical for the reef to remain in balance, then we can end up destroying the very thing that we want to preserve, and that is bringing us income. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. We also look at empowering rural fishing villages, people in rural fishing villages, as they prepare to face climate change and the impacts of climate change. What does that have to do with artificial intelligence? Well, AI allows the average person to be able to do highly specialized stuff by taking the heavy lifting off of the human, and all the human needs to do is just navigate the robot. And that's the simplest way of putting it. The average person is able to utilize the robots because they're very simple to use. We don't have videos of them available right now due to technology issues. But by being able to collect this data, that data now goes into the algorithm and the global data set to allow for marine biologists and governments around the world, and even throughout the region, to pool that data together. And in pooling that data together, they're able to create policies that affect not just the present, but the future, and also know how those policies will affect or could affect in the future. So that's a summary of what we're doing. There is more that we're doing, but at this point in time, I'm not at liberty to go into details. Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you very much as well, Antonio. It was really nice to have you on and to learn more about the Bluebot project and the interesting intersection, obviously, of artificial intelligence and machine learning as it relates to marine conservation and marine ecology. I think it's very exciting. I like the ability to use the underwater robot to perform a lot of these tasks and to shorten the time for analysis as well. I think that is really key to increase efficiency and also hopefully effectiveness as well. Because obviously there's certain things that the computer generated algorithm will pick up. And it's not to say that that will be used exclusively, and obviously the expertise of certain persons won't also go into the actual data analysis, but that definitely reduces the workload for what could be a very mundane and a very extenuated process. So I really thank you for joining us and to giving us that presentation. And now we turn to our final panelist, Dr. Reia Guppy. And I will give her a brief introduction. Dr. Reia Guppy is an assistant professor in the Marine Sciences Department at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, UTT. She is a marine ecologist whose research was rooted in coral reef health and disease, but through the years has expanded to marine and coastal environmental health, population genetic connectivity and resilience, marine pollution and ecotoxicology, and more recently, environmental forensics. Since 1996, Dr. Guppy has actively contributed to and participated in coastal and marine biological and ecological research around the world, such as the Caribbean and Latin America, Thailand, and Australia. She has represented Trinidad and Tobago in the Small Island Developing States Ocean Acidification Workshop in Apia, Samoa, and currently sits on several scientific committees, such as Caribbean Initiative with France and Guadeloupe, Life Adapt Island in Guadeloupe, and on the cabinet-appointed National Sea Turtle Task Force in Trinidad. Dr. Guppy is the founder of Terra Forensic Science Services and co-founder of Eurodrex. She has initiated a national megagenomics project in Trinidad and Tobago in order to obtain genetic fingerprints for both flora and fauna in the hopes that it can be utilized in the fight against illegal poaching and trade, as well in support of the Nagoya Protocol initiatives. Dr. Guppy has a bachelor's in marine biology from the University of West Florida, two master's degrees, one in biology from the University of Central Arkansas, and the other in pharmacology with a special focus in forensic science from the University of Florida, and a PhD in marine ecology from Newcastle University in the UK. She's an avid scuba diver, loves underwater photography, and is a supporter of several animal welfare groups. I introduce to you now Dr. Reia Guppy.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I look forward to sharing some of this information with you as it relates to some of the drugs that we can potentially get from marine resources. This is something that is relatively untouched in the Caribbean, and I say relatively untouched because bioprospecting, which is the idea behind trying to find components, products from the natural environment and finding some sort of a usage from them, a way that we can commercialize this. Bioprospecting and just the idea behind pharmaceuticals, cosmeceuticals, which is where you would end up with beauty products, etc., nutraceuticals, things that can be used that are edible. This industry as a whole is a $1.25 trillion industry. Just finding natural products and commercializing it. From a marine perspective, this is a $329 billion US dollar industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So this has the potential from a global perspective to be extremely lucrative. And part of this, as it relates to the marine environment, marine invertebrates in particular are classed as generally the most important sources of these potential products. It's not the only group. They could go from microbes all the way up through to mammals. But any sort of activities that we have, any sort of chemicals that we utilize, when I say we as a living organism, any sort of product that we produce can potentially have some sort of additional use. And within a marine environment, there are three ultimately basic reasons why marine products and marine organisms are special and can potentially be very lucrative for the Caribbean and from a global perspective. The first and foremost, these are organisms that live in an aquatic environment. And that means that if they have to defend themselves, they need to have extra potent chemical compounds, because the second it's released into the environment, there's going to be an issue with dilution. So the potency of chemical defenses that are utilized by marine organisms are extremely strong. Some information that and some research that was done to give you some level of context is that there are zoanthids, for example, that are known to be affect your breathing, your heart, and generally research that was done indicated that its potency, its ability to kill brine shrimp, which is something that is done in toxicology, that it was on order of 250 micrograms per ml. In Trinidad and Tobago, when we repeated the exact same study, our zoanthids had as low as 3 micrograms per ml in terms of their potency, which meant that our zoanthids that we tested could have killed you that much faster. The chemical defenses that are utilized by organisms, generally, like anything else in terrestrial ecology, anything that's brightly colored and looks nice and lush and fat and juicy to eat up, tends to be really bad. And it's the same thing in the marine environment. Those that are relatively slow moving, brightly colored, tend to have a lot of toxins built up in them. And this is because they need the extra chemical defenses because they can't swim away, at least not in time for their predators, to escape their predators. Lastly, chemicals that are found in many organisms, this is not just unique to marine organisms, have been found to have some level of homology. Homology meaning that there are some shared characteristics. When we think about marine drugs, there are target sites. And these target sites are potentially conserved between species. And therefore, the proteins typically that we are isolating from the natural world, even though it has one particular function for one species, it can fit. If you think about a lock and key, it can fit into the lock in another species, although it may have a different function. And a classic example of this are the glue that barnacles have to stick to tightly adhere to the surfaces. And these particular proteins have been known to be able to be used by humans in a fight or flight receptor. So, you know, when your adrenaline keeps going, we can use these proteins to help excite and or reduce the impact of the flight or fright adrenal hormones, which can mean that we can potentially save a life. Now, when we think about these organisms, the sorts of compounds that are primarily of interest are what are known as secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites are these things that are utilized for defense mechanisms, etc. And they can be broken down into a variety of chemical groups. And of all of the organisms that have been tested, and this is, you know, like a needle in the haystack, and that's where we're at this moment. When it comes to the invertebrate sources of chemicals, These sponges, which are the porifera, and corals, the coral world, which are the cnidarians, these two collectively are, at this moment in time, the primary sources of metabolites, secondary metabolites that have been useful for the pharmaceutical industry. Now, in the Caribbean, we are dominated in our marine environment by sponges. Our reef environments are primarily sponge dominated, with, of course, corals as well. And therefore, as a potential, the marine environments throughout the Caribbean are, as I said before, potentially lucrative. The other major group are the snails and slugs, which are collectively called the mollusks. They have a lot of potential and potent venoms that are used for their defense mechanisms, as well as for their for feeding. And therefore, these three groups are the primary target areas and the primary target organisms for marine natural products and for isolation of marine natural products. Now, when we talk about the isolation of marine natural products, this whole idea of bioprospecting is literally at this point in time trying to find the right organism that has, that checks off all of these characteristics, that they potentially have potent venom that can be utilized. Because it's a venom, and it could be and it's not only venom, but it's the easiest one to kind of follow through the process. We need to be able to have enough of the raw material so that we can extract these materials, isolate it, purify it, screen it, and create a crude extract so we can do these specialized bioassays to detect the potential levels of activities. And so you have, if it's a viral, antiviral, anti-cancer, anti-cardio, whatever you are trying to target, you want to test a wide variety. The isolation and screening process is perhaps the most costly aspect of this, because again, you're testing one organism, getting a crude extract, and you're producing a variety of mixed chemicals, and these mixed chemicals can have their own is indefinite in terms of the sorts of tests that can be done. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies invest in this sort of isolation and screening. Once there are potential compounds that are isolated, then we must identify these particular compounds. So we end up getting the structure of this and try to recreate this from an artificial perspective, because we can't continuously take from the natural environment because we'll have nothing left. So we try to find a way to recreate these particular chemicals and ultimately try to find and ensure that these chemicals have the same bioactivity as the original organisms. Now, part of the tricky part here is that the chemicals that are extracted from these organisms, based on the environmental conditions, based on the depth, the salinity, the temperature, time of year, from the same exact species, can potentially isolate different compounds with different bioactivities. So it makes it a little bit more complex. It's not a simple process in trying to get enough of the same compound. Once we have this sort of a targeted compound, then we must go through the process of testing and trials. And once you have those testing and trials down pat and having the FDA approvals, then it goes through marketing and patents, which potentially has large potential for profit. This whole process from bioprospecting, from that needle in the haystack sort of approach, to coming to something that is something that can go onto the shelf into the market, can take years. And through these years, it's going to take lots of money, which is why this whole industry is so potentially lucrative when you find something. On average, it takes anywhere between 10 and 15 years. It can take even 50 years, depending on the compounds and the complexity of the organisms and the isolates that are achieved. Now, do we need such fancy things? Well, throughout time, the first earliest record for use of a natural extract from a marine environment for medical purposes, the earliest record is over 5,000 years old. It wasn't in it for the money. They did it just from, trial and error. Sponges have been used for their anti-inflammatory impacts, and they used to put and package wounds that soldiers had to help reduce that inflammation. The electric fish extracts were used to cure headaches and migraines. Stingray spines were used to alleviate toothaches because of the venom that's within there. The palytoxin from the zoanthid Palithoa, this is what the species that I was talking about from earlier, have been used for rheumatism, bruises, inflammation. Seaweeds have been used for iodine deficiencies, and more recently have been known to help pregnant women if they are anemic. So we know from the grandmother days that they've been able to take natural products from our environment, inclusive of marine environment, and use it for various ailments. Today, a lot of those compounds from the marine environment specifically has a variety of potential, ranging from the antibacterial all the way through to an anticoagulant. So they're used for viruses, funguses, bacteria, protozoans, which are very small organisms, parasites, cancer, anti-inflammatory. The list goes on and on and on. And therefore, the kinds of compounds that can be extracted and the sorts of testing that can be done is huge. Just to kind of bring it into perspective, some of the sponges, corals and tunicates that have been found in the Caribbean. One of the earliest studies and identifications of a sponge started as early as the 1950s, where isolations for what is now known as RSC have been used for anti-cancer property, or has been identified with anti-cancer properties. Similarly, with a very, very common soft coral and a tunicate have all been with very different targets, but similarly with anti-cancer properties. So whether it's a soft sarcoma or something like that. Other corals have been known to have different isolates as well for cancer and anti-cancer properties. You have anti-cardiovascular agents as well. Now, in any sort of organism, there are thousands of compounds with potential activity. The Cryptotethia is another sponge. You have marine algae. You have even octopus, chemical compounds that have been utilized, not necessarily for anti-cardiovascular actual FDA-approved drugs, but with the potential for a cardiotonic and or hypertensive usages. We also have anti-inflammatories as an example. One of the first FDA-approved drug that was found was something that was isolated from a cone snail. And this cone snail and this drug was called Prialt, is actually been known to be almost 1,000 times stronger and more effective than morphine, which means that even the potential for for morphine, morphine is very addictive. Potentially, Prialt has the option of not being as addictive, sorry. From the pufferfish, which is a common species around the Caribbean, you can get tetrodotoxin. And this, again, is something that can be utilized for anti-inflammatory. And it's found the chemicals have been isolated both from the liver and from the ovaries. It's not only just from toxins. You can get things from the liver, which is a huge chemical factory in a body, in the intestines, in the ovaries, the kidneys. There's a whole variety of things. Something a little bit less traditional and what persons may know about is mangroves. Mangrove leaves have been used throughout small island states to be used as the extracts, the teas that have been drawn up, have been used as an antiviral, a variety of antiviral diseases. It's been used for diarrhea, stomach aches, diabetes, inflammation, mosquito repellents even. So it's not any one size fits all. In the Caribbean, one of the things that we lack is the dedication towards finding some of these compounds. And I say lack, and I'm not, as a marine biologist, I'm always cautious because I want to protect the marine environment. But at the same time, I also know that there's a lot of value in our marine environment. Throughout the Caribbean, we have generally very, very few efforts towards this hunt towards natural products and marine natural products that can be utilized in the pharmaceutical industry and biopharma as a whole. The most effort is coming from the Bahamas and Puerto Rico, and a lot of that is coming from the donor funds that are utilized. Much of the other islands are doing it as self-sustainable small projects, etc. So, and I know time is critical, so I just wanted to introduce those sorts of ideas, but I want to leave you with this idea in terms of what the potential is, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and potential threats. In terms of the Caribbean, we are a rich source of biodiversity. We are and are tied to, as well as other small island states, is that we are very tied to traditional knowledge. We have a lot of information, but not necessarily all of the science to back it up. So in terms of the potential for funds, in terms of opportunities, there are thousands upon thousands of potential compounds and earning potential that we have, especially if we are able to have the right collaboration, the right ethical collaboration, and as well as the screening opportunities that can be done. But this ultimately takes a lot of research and development, which is really one of our weaknesses, generally speaking, because research and development and the screening and isolation process takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money, things that we don't really have in the Caribbean, at least not readily. And of course, because our environment changes so rapidly throughout the year, and now with climate change, which is throwing in another, spanner in the wheel, the consistency of what we can isolate may be impacted. And the other major effort in terms of a weakness that I see, which is also a potential threat, is the lack of proper governance to help support not just the potential earning potential, but the protecting the natural resource as a whole, because it's a balance that we must strive for, as in anything else. And that balance is that we only have finite resources. Corals, for example, grow relatively really slow. Marine algae can grow really, really fast. Marine algae is used for fuel, biofuels, etc. So if it is that we continue to act without properly protecting our environment, we are losing not just the classic, protection from our environment and protection from storms, from mangrove seagrasses, corals, etc. But we're also potentially losing a relatively large store of revenue, whether we act on that that revenue or not. We are losing ecosystem value. And by not signing on to these international collaborations and international conventions, one of the ones is the Nagoya Protocol, which protects species and protects countries from losing these organisms to the R&D efforts of large countries and developing countries. If we don't put things in place, we're actually going to be losing a lot more than just coastal protection, etc. And time is pretty much up with that, so I'll leave you with that and say thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to the engaging conversations after this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guppy. Really exciting presentation. I like the journey that you took us on in terms of drug discovery and bioprospecting within the Caribbean. That is something that we here at the center are very much interested in. And I particularly like the concept of trying to add value to the ocean environment, where we see it as more than just conservation, but see it also in terms of missed opportunities. Not that we want to exploit the marine environment, but that we would want to safeguard it because of the intrinsic value that is present there. So I really thank you for that. And now we will have our panel discussion with the panelists. And for those who are still in the audience, I would just ask you to place your questions in the question and answer section, and then we will pose these questions to the panelists. So the panelists, could you turn on your cameras and unmute your mics? I will start with the first question in the question and answer, which states, in terms of the ballast water management and the requirements for ships to undergo, do you see this as effective? And are there studies showing this? And I guess this would go to Dayne. In terms, the person is asking regarding ballast water management and the requirements that they have to undergo. Do we see this as being effective in the current, in the present time?
All right. So one thing we have to bear in mind is the context of this. Ships were never designed to sample ballast water. They were never designed to exchange water on the high seas. It's a safety concern. Once the ship is stable in the bay, in the port, it remains stable, hopefully until it gets to the other port where it's safer and more controlled. So all the ships prior to the Ballast Water Convention coming into play in 2017 are required to do open ocean exchange. It's still risky, and the captain can still decide, I am not going to do this and risk my crew and my vessel because weather conditions are bad. Now, that being said, if a ship it actually does that 95% volumetric exchange, which is required on the high seas or the open ocean, it is very effective in terms of removing as much as possible the potentially harmful marine invasive species, whether it's disease or whether it's animals that can impact ecologically native species. It is pretty effective. The newer ships that are being built with the different filtration and UV treatments and all of these other technologies have been showing very effective results in removing invasive species before that discharge happens. It will take some time for all ships to have onboard treatment facilities. You have to understand that this does take up quite a bit of space on the vessel. It requires more energy use, more fuel use for these vessels as well. So those are the kind of scenarios that you have to bear in mind, but it's highly effective to meet those standards.
Okay. I'll just also take that question and kind of shift it over to ocean governance. And Sanya, could you weigh in terms of ballast water management and how that fits into the ocean governance conversation within the Caribbean?
Well, one of the things that
Sorry, Dayne. I'll just pass it on to Sanya
okay, no
first.
problem.
We can always
Sorry.
circle back because there's some more questions in the chat that I'll get to, and your topic seems to be quite trendy, so we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I learned like you, Dr. Douglas, that a bit more about ballast water and management. And again, that is key to ocean governance. We do depend heavily on our maritime services, such as transportation and shipping, as I would have mentioned in my presentation. But we also have to look at the ecological impacts that, you know, this has on the environment, and those things have to be taken into consideration and must be taken into consideration if we are to indeed execute this good governance. You have to take again into consideration those ecological impacts that it would have and be able to manage them effectively. I mean, I know for the lionfish, which was particularly invasive throughout the Caribbean region, they have had lionfish derbies and certain things that have been put in place, not necessarily as a governance sort of thing, but it does at the end of the day play into all of that. So all of these things have to be pulled into the realm of governance, and you have to look at all the different facets and aspects to governance, which includes, you know, management, includes these protocols and environmental agreements that are essential to good governance, and they have to be done, and they have to be done at the national level. This is where a lot of the weakness in governance really lies, because you need to be understanding what's happening in your own backyard and be able to respond to that effectively.
Thank you very much, Sanya. I agree with you. And also, Antonio, what role would you see in terms of, let's say, for instance, for this particular issue, now with respect to the Caribbean legislation in terms of ballast water management? That's something that we want to research a bit more here in the Caribbean to see what is currently existing. But in terms of enforcement, if, let's say, for instance, regional legislation was put into place at the CARICOM level, where Caribbean governments are legislating that any ocean-going vessel coming into the territorial waters have to adhere to these particular regulations. How then would that be managed? And in terms of what Sanya is saying, there are efforts obviously within the Caribbean online to help with the threats of invasive species that come along with ballast water management. But how, for instance, the Coast Guard or CZMU, the Coastal Zone Management Unit, how would AI and machine learning play a role in tackling a problem like that?
Thanks for that question. That's a very nice question to have. I have to answer it very carefully because of what we're working on. So yes, what can machine learning and AI do? It can speed up the monitoring process. One of the things that we're working on, I can mention this. One of the things that we're working on is the ability to have faster anomaly detection when it comes to a particular area. So the concept is that once you have enough data, you're able to have a baseline of how that area is operating. And any changes that occur, the AI will detect. Now, what we found in the R&D phase of what we were doing is that if you look at it from a human looking at it visually, even in terms of sensor data, there are subtle changes that we won't pick up. They're on time scales that are either too fast or time scales that are either too slow. However, with machine learning, and AI, we're able to project, or we're able to detect these subtle changes that would occur in the relationships beforehand. Now, that comes with some very interesting frameworks. One would be, the ethics of collecting the data. You would really be collecting image, sensor, all kind of sensor data that impacts things like national security, that impacts the food security, that impacts the tourism industry, especially that impacts transportation. And when you put those policies in place, especially when you map them throughout the Caribbean, you begin to see that it gives the Caribbean power, but it also exposes us to new ways of thinking that I don't know if we're ready for it yet. So I'm giving an example of this. This is an example that we have here. You may have government policy in place, and you may have your respective units that are collecting data. They may have an established way of doing things. AI now comes into the picture, and AI, of course, needs to be standardized in terms of the algorithm. It has to be standardized in terms of the data. You have to make sure the data is not biased. There are processes that you need to put in place in order for that to be effective. But let's say that it's not effective. How do you litigate, or how do you challenge the results that come from an AI that's monitoring your report? In terms of it saying, okay, there's an anomaly here, your ship was the last person. How do you protect yourself from misuse of that technology? Those are things that come up. How do you protect yourself from the errors that would occur? Because errors will occur. What if an anomaly is detected and I challenge it? Are you going to now be wanting to go through my algorithm? So do I have the right to go through the algorithm? Do I have the right to look at the data set? There are all these other things that come into play when it comes to the legality of it, when it comes to AI. So whereas a human being looking at something, you could negotiate and quibble and look at the process and see where the biases may be, so you have some wiggle room. From the time you bring artificial intelligence into the picture, that bandwidth of that wiggle room gets smaller. And
I can see that would be an issue in terms of data privacy, sovereignty of data as well.
Data sovereignty is a big issue. Yeah.
I would be picking up more than just, ecological activity, but other activity that could be ongoing as well. So there would be national security implications, etc. So that is definitely a given. But I think that with respect to the ballast water management, it is something which Dayne had mentioned, we know the results of. We know that these things occur within the Caribbean. We have the remnants of the activity, or the impacts, I should say, that have negatively impacted our shores. But I'm just curious too, I'll toss this over to you, Dr. Guppy, in terms of, for instance, a vessel does their ballast water exchange, and from this ballast water is deposited some organism of economic value that now takes up the habitat here in the Caribbean, from which you can now derive, bio-extractives. But yet still, it is, I'm just saying, maybe that could be a possibility, right? And it now is an actual threat to the environment. How is something like that known?
I think we as Caribbean people are very good about finding opportunities. If you think of the lionfish, we found an opportunity to fill our bellies. So, there was the activity to gain income by having the derbies and finding different ways to cook it and eat it. The venom in there can be potentially utilized for other purposes as well. The spines can be utilized for jewelry, etc. The thing with an invasive species coming through it, particularly in ballast water, I think the actual problem is the danger that we really don't even know what is invasive and what is native, especially when we're talking about plankton. The things that are coming through in ballast water are larval forms, are really teeny tiny stuff, they're plankton. And we don't really know there's a problem until there's a problem, you know? And so, I mean, there's a question in the chat in terms of, you know, do we know how much invasive species that we have? No. Simple answer is no, because again, we don't really know what we truly have, especially when it relates to plankton. We might know, and we spend a lot of funds doing things on more of the macroorganisms, you know, the corals, the crabs, the lobster, the shark, the, you know, what have you, the conch. But as it relates to ballast water, we're supposed to be looking at plankton, and there's a Globalis project that throughout the Caribbean that had tasked countries to identify the plankton, particularly the zooplankton, in their waters. But there is a general lack of taxonomists in the Caribbean that focus on this. So yes, there's always a potential. One of the things that I didn't present on, there are marine toxins that are coming from some of the zooplankton that are related to red tides, for example. Those sorts of toxins have the potential from a pharmaceutical perspective, but we focus on those marine toxins because they lead to fish kills, which will obviously have an impact on fishing and fisheries income, as well as tourism impacts, etc. Sargassum, which is by some persons considered as invasive also now to the Caribbean, and certainly to the Southern Caribbean, which it never really had a big presence before, are now being used for fertilizers. We are working on we have a crude extract at the moment that we're trying to purify for an anti-fogging agent, for example, from a marine alga that exists in Trinidad and Tobago, and I suspect a common organism. So with ballast water, there's always, any organism has the potential, because there's microbes that we can utilize that could be potentially invasive. But again, we have no idea what is actually invasive or not. But there's always an avenue for money. You know, it's a matter of are we prepared to do the work?
That's very true. Well, thank you for your response. I'll just go back into the chat to look for some comments that I may have just gone over, and I'll take this one from Rosal Jeffers. And to the doctor who presented on ballast water, is the ballast water taken into the ship before they leave port, or if so, can the fresh water be pumped into the ship instead of seawater?
Okay, so generally the ship is balanced off with ballast water before they leave the port. In some instances, based on the design of the port or the harbor, they may take it on leaving the port. Fresh water, you're talking about quite a lot of fresh water here. And fresh water is a lot, in many instances on islands, it's one of those high commodities, very sought after. There's ample seawater around. So the cost of using fresh water versus seawater is a big disparity. So seawater definitely is the most practical one. It's right there. The ship has pumps. They put it in the tanks. The difficulty is treating that water. So whether it was fresh water or seawater, it is going to have organisms. Even if you put fresh water inside those ballast tanks, there will be mixing of sediments from marine sources as well as residual seawater that's inside anyway. So that fresh water won't remain fresh for too many voyages anyway. Just to touch on a couple of points before about what we know, what we don't know in terms of ballast water coming in. I was part of a port biological baseline survey a while back for the IMO during the Global Ballast program. And it took us a long time, a couple of years, to even gather existing taxonomic data on Kingston Harbor, one of the largest ports in the Caribbean, in addition to gathering primary data to assess for planktonic species, whether it's larval species or planktonic adults. But it takes a long time. So what the IMO has been promoting is for countries to participate in knowledge sharing. So if a ship is leaving from Kingston Harbor, destined for Trinidad and Tobago, and we know we have these invasive species inside our harbor, communicate with Trinidad. Be on the lookout for these things. So when you're doing your rapid testing of a potential, if a ship wasn't able to do exchange or treatment en route to Trinidad, you have the right, Trinidad does have the right to detain the vessel, test the ballast water, and then allow the ship to discharge. So that's something that has been promoted as well, in order to manage and do that risk assessment. As a region, for ships coming from outside the region, crossing the Atlantic, that's something that we have been promoting as well, to have a regional policy or a regional legislation to ensure that all ships entering the region have to have ballast water treatment or management systems before they get into the region itself. So all countries then benefit from that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buddo. And I guess...
Sorry, can I just add something there as well? I mean, one of the other options that have been utilized, if there's funds available and space available, there's also where you have, instead of the actual natural exchange, you can have tank systems that are built on the port where they can be dumped. They're very, very expensive, but it depends on how much your environment is worth to you. Some of the European countries kind of do this, so they don't actually allow any actual dumping of ballast water into the ports, into the harbors. They prefer to put it into a separate, let's call it a septic system, if you will, so that it is processed.
Facility.
Yeah, but we're not prepared for those sorts of things in the Caribbean, anywhere close to that, but there are options that can be done. And the thing that we need to perhaps do is, and this comes back to governance, is to ensure that we have we stick to our guns. We're all too often just trying to get the economy. We're just trying to get the vessels to come to our country to have the exchanges. We want to have that exchange of goods. But some countries that are more environmentally inclined, I said, we want your business, we definitely do, but you must have these sorts of systems in place. You must show proof of X, Y, and Z. And having the vessels sit, which is time is money, having a vessel sit outside a port, time is money, and who's going to bear that cost? And the testing kits are available. They can be a little bit costly. The D1 and D2 kits are available. It's a matter of, do we actually go out and do it? And COVID now has actually put an additional strain on the system, because now they don't really want persons boarding the vessels to actually take samples and these sorts of things. So it's a little bit more complex right now.
Well, I just like to share a little good news that happened, right? I always like to share some good news. I remember a couple of years ago, I was called to test a ship coming from Haiti when they had a cholera outbreak. And we boarded, took the sample. The ship was outside our port, and we eventually had to turn the ship back with all the commodity that was on that. But it's something that we had to do, and we just had to do it because the risk of cholera being transmitted to Jamaica via ballast water was significant. So again, it's, as a country, how serious are you with biosecurity? That's the decision.
That's I think the crux of the matter. How much does it matter to you in terms of protecting the lives and the livelihoods of your particular jurisdiction? And Sanya, what would you say then would be, and I know I'm kind of putting you on the gun, but in terms of the pathway for this particular issue, now we would have to advocate for CARICOM, lobby for them to make this a significant issue. What would it take, in your opinion, to gain traction at that regional level to activate something like that?
I think this kind of goes back to what I would have alluded to. You know, we all suffer from limited capacities in this region, and so we need to leverage support where we can. And you know, it is essential to have the exchange of information and knowledge, because this might be information that is not necessarily privy to those who are sometimes responsible for creating these policies. So again, that traditional knowledge, that scientific knowledge needs to be then supported at these levels, and engagement of the appropriate groups, having them fully involved in these processes where you do have these agreements that are in place. And it goes back to, again, that national level support, because you need it at the national level in order to influence policy, even at the regional level. So being able to facilitate that process as best as you can. The data, again, we are a data poor region, and a lot of things are not supported by the data. It is all sometimes well and good to talk about the science, but the science also needs to be supported in that sense. So, you know, having the necessary collaborations where we have the information, you know, we have some results here, but we also need to have that fully supported through data analysis, and be able to present that in a way that is also understandable to the folks who are then responsible for creating these policies. And again, governance is a very holistic and interactive environment where you have to involve all these players, and that doesn't necessarily happen, but you also have to identify the folks who need to be involved and get that conversation started. This is a start to that conversation right here. This is an opportunity. This can be shared, and this is where we need to start. I mean, in terms of this particular issue and topic. So that's how I see it. It is a collaborative effort that we really need to get on board with, share the data, have the relevant stakeholders involved, and get that information out there so that you can influence policy.
There was a question from Reia Mohammed. Can using population-based genetics or communities analysis be used to screen ballast water or eDNA work?
Yes, we've used environmental DNA work to look at shark populations, especially in murky waters where visual ID is not possible. And that has worked, you know. But again, what you're looking at with ballast water is hundreds and thousands of different species. And to create the DNA signatures for all of those in a facility where you can take a sample, run it through environmental DNA procedures, and actually get some useful results. So for sharks, you know, we're targeting a particular number. It's not a big number of species that we're targeting, but for ballast water, it's significantly more. So yes, it can work, but the practicality of using environmental DNA for that is very costly, and I don't think it's really going to yield that much results. If it ideally it would work, but it's just not practical, not for ballast water.
Okay, well, thank you for that question.
Just want to jump in there a minute, sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Antonio.
And this is where machine learning comes in. Because yes, it may be a lot of data for a human being to go through to look at the different samples and such like. But marine big data is something that is the buzzword right now. It's an industry that is looking to grow by about 20% over the next decade. And the advantage of machine learning solutions is that the more data you have, especially if you have good data, the more data you have, the more robust systems you can build. So yes, you may not be looking at, it may not be humanly feasible to look at thousands of images or thousands of species, but again, don't want to go too far to what we're doing, but the relationships, because the interactions, that's the best word, the interactions of those thousands of species will have particular markers. And whereas the traditional way of, kind of went in the weeds a bit, but the traditional way of looking at an individual species and trying to find where they fit in the quote unquote circle of life may be too difficult for us human to do, but looking at the overall fingerprint that emerges from the interactions that occur within these species, between these species, that's something that might be able to pick up.
And I think even without the actual DNA approach, are the D2 and D1 kits, are these using DNA or is this purely microscopic analysis? This is Dayne or Reia?
Yeah. So I mean, they're microscopic.
Microscopic. So what I was thinking,
microscopic. It's a sampling kit.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of what, getting back to what Antonio is mentioning. I know the traditional way would be to look at, with a microscope to look and identify individual species. However, if you have like what he has, the technology, then you would have to obviously inform the model of what is what. But once you've done that and created a library of images with the correct identification and taxonomy, then it's just a matter of basically looking at a video footage of the water or maybe images, microscopic images, slides, and therefore you can then increase and expedite that particular process. It will be a mammoth task, don't get me wrong, but I think that would be quite cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's technology now where you can actually run a seawater sample through and get plankton data from that. So the days of looking through a microscope and counting and enumerating, the eyes still hurt from those days. But those days are
mine too.
Those days are numbered, right? You can literally hook up this machine to the seawater outlet from the ballast tanks. And while it's pumping through, you're enumerating and you're qualifying those species as well. So that technology does exist. The environmental DNA one, it's a little bit more difficult, but just simply enumerating the species, which is where you come back to the D2 standards anyway. It's the number of organisms per volume. So it's definitely feasible.
Okay, I think at this time, we'll have to shut off. There's one last question there, but I think I will follow up with Mr. Mohammed on this one. But I want to thank all of the participants today. This webinar was very insightful, very informative. And I hope that those in the audience, you did get the value for your time, because I know your time is obviously of high importance. And I would like to thank also the SIDS, Sam and his team over there, and also Mr. Wesley Moore. He's also a member of the team at CBS as well, who's joined us. And for all of those panelists who've taken the time to spend their afternoon with us and to actually participate in this webinar. This is part one. We will have to have more parts than just this one. So I know for the panelists, the 10 minutes is quite compressed, but as you can tell from this particular format, anything above that will get, will reduce the time for the actual interaction and discussion. But before everyone leaves, I want to also just do a bit of housekeeping and to just inform you of some upcoming events at the Center for Biosecurity Studies. We will be soon launching our professional short courses, and we want to definitely just inform you of what is coming, and these will be starting in February. The first one is the biosecurity course. The first thing is the actual newsletter. We have a newsletter, it's called the Biosecurity Times, and we invite contributions from persons from around the region within the 3 focal areas that I would have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And those 3 focal areas would be climate change and its impacts, maritime issues and the blue economy, and also border security and trade. You can send in those articles to us, and we will go through them. We will then tell you and respond to you and let you know if you were successful, and we will feature them in our newsletter. So the next edition will be launched in December, so you can stay tuned for that. These are the professional short courses. The first one is Biosecurity More Than Meets the Eye. So this is delving into risk management and the redefined concept of biosecurity for the Caribbean and what that means in terms of the scientific and also the practical understanding of biosecurity. This will be 15 contact hours, 5 modules, starting in February 2022, so just a few months away. Though that's the cost of it, and we are asking you to enroll with the Center for Professional and the Professional Development, and Lifelong Learning, CPDLL, and you can see the contact information there. You can enroll and sign up for the course if you're really interested, and we hope that you come so that we can actually share some knowledge and some key insight and case studies that go along with it. One partner with that particular course is the Caribbean Risk Management Academy from Trinidad and Tobago. The second professional short course we have running in February as well, and these will run concurrently, is Living a Wildlife, Catch Me If You Can, Part 1. And this will be examining illegal wildlife trade and wildlife trade, money laundering and border security within the Caribbean, and also with relation to the other threats of infectious diseases and biodiversity decline. And again, this is 15 contact hours, 5 modules, launching in February. That's the cost there. We're partnering with UNODC, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, CITES as well. And again, you can enroll for these courses through CPDLL. And that's the information there. And the final course is Biosecurity Living a Wildlife, but this is part 2. And this will be zoning in on wildlife activity within the Caribbean, zoonoses, pandemics, the influence of tourism, and also the whole One Health aspect from the wild meat eating that some parts of the Caribbean that we are accustomed to, in Trinidad and Guyana, and throughout some of the actual Windward Islands as well. And also the risks that are posed, and to understand the risk of these novel infectious diseases actually emerging within the Caribbean. So all very exciting and very engaging. We definitely encourage you to sign up and to participate and come and learn as we share with you. So on that note, I will bid you all a pleasant good afternoon, and thank you once again for joining us. Do have a great afternoon. Take care.